For today's video, I've gotten my hands on a 2019 Mazda CX-5 because the CX-5 and the Toyota RAV4 are my two top picks in the compact crossover segment right now. And even though this is a RAV4 Hybrid and this is a turbocharged CX-5, this comparison makes a little bit of sense because the turbocharged CX-5 is my favorite version of the CX-5 and the Hybrid is my favorite version of the RAV4. And even when you dig a little bit deeper, this comparison still makes a little bit of sense because even though the turbocharged model starts at $31,445 and will go all the way up to about $37,000 just as we're looking at here, this RAV4 Hybrid can get a little bit more expensive, up to $39,000. So these are definitely direct competitors. Which is the best compact crossover for you? Well, that's exactly what we're going to look at in this video. Taking a look up front, both models have standard LED headlamps, although in the top-end trims, the CX-5's headlamps turn in the corners, which is something that I really like. And this RAV4 over here, for not too far off the same price as this, they don't turn in the corners. Both models have radar sensors right here behind their logos, although we have a bigger Mazda logo on the front. And I think that I like the Mazda look overall a little bit better. The Mazda CX-5 is quite simply one of the most attractive compact crossovers in America, whether we're talking about mainstream options like this RAV4 or the CR-V, or even some near luxury options. I think this look holds its own even when compared against models like Audis and BMWs. At 180.9 inches long, the RAV4 is definitely not the longest entry in this segment. This is significantly shorter than something like the Volkswagen Tiguan, which is available with an optional third row in the back. As I said before, this generation of the RAV4 has definitely become more stylish than the last generation. It also is a little bit more truck-like in the way that they've decided to shape these wheel wells right here. They've also made it a little bit boxier. I think that's an attractive look, but it still has some interesting, odd design cues that are not exactly my preference. We have these tail lamp modules that stick out a little bit from the body. I don't personally mind this floating roof design. It's what they call this little black bar right here, but a lot of people really seem to dislike that particular look. I have to say that I do like the RAV4 with the two-tone design where the roof is a different color than the body. But again, overall, definitely more attractive than the last generation RAV4, and I think it's an attractive look overall. I really like the front end on the RAV4 with the Adventure trim. But it's just not as attractive as this Mazda CX-5 design right here. The CX-5 has this long hood profile that we see in a number of other Mazdas out there. On the downside, that does result in a slightly smaller cabin on the inside. This cabin from the dashboard all the way back there to the tailgate is about 4 or 5 inches shorter than the RAV4, and that really is noticeable when you take a look at this on the outside. It's about the same length overall as the RAV4. It's only about an inch different, but the proportions are quite different. We have that longer hood, we have a shorter, tighter body back here, and then we have a much swoopier, rounded rear end. The overall look of the CX-5 is definitely a little bit more reminiscent of a luxury or near luxury vehicle than something like the RAV4 or the CR-V. I definitely think this wins the award for being quite simply the most attractive entry in this segment. When it comes to off-road ability, these two vehicles are generally well matched when we're talking about the non-hybrid RAV4 or any of the versions of the CX-5, although the CX-5 does have a little bit less ground clearance. The hybrid is the closest to the ground for the RAV4 line, and we get 8.1 inches of clearance versus 7.5 in the CX-5. So that means you could take this RAV4 a little bit further off the beaten path to get a little bit more clearance. But when it comes to the all-wheel drive system's capability, remember that the RAV4 Hybrid does not have a mechanical all-wheel drive system like we do find in the CX-5. Now, it's worth noting that in this generation of the RAV4 Hybrid, Toyota has significantly improved the performance of the E all-wheel drive system. And this E all-wheel drive system is just as capable as the average crossover owner will need, whether we're talking about inclement weather traction, mild off-roading, or even moderate off-roading, something that, honestly, most crossover shoppers will never try. This generation of the RAV4 has the ability to apportion power pretty equally front to rear axle, up to about 160 pound-feet of torque being delivered from the drivetrain total. So that's pretty close to maximum power output for this particular model. But in the CX-5, this can perfectly balance power depending on the needs of the situation, thanks to its mechanical all-wheel drive system. And of course, we have more torque available in the CX-5. Which of these models would I pick if I were going to take a small crossover on a more difficult trail? I have to say I would probably choose the RAV4 because of its greater ground clearance, and at that point, remember that tires are everything. So if you were to put off-road tires on either one of these vehicles, snow tires on either one of these vehicles, it would be the one that would excel at those tests versus the other option on stock tires. Moving to the rear, the RAV4's mini truck-like styling continues. We see some elements borrowed from some of the rest of Toyota's lineup back here. Dual exhaust tips even in the hybrid model. Moving over here to the CX-5, we have a much more rounded theme than the angular thing going on there with the RAV4. Again, dual exhaust tips down there. full LED tail lamp modules, which are a really nice touch in the CX-5. This is something that Mazda's been doing a lot of, and we find combination elements over here in the RAV4 that's a little bit more typical in the mainstream segment, instead of the full LED lamps that we find in the luxury segment, for instance. So it's really obvious when you take a look at the CX-5 that Mazda was really trying to make this a more premium vehicle than the average entry in this segment, even though the CX-5 is not necessarily priced like a premium vehicle. All trims of both vehicles have a 2.5-liter engine, but Mazda and Toyota are going after their top-end customers in a slightly different fashion. So over here in this Mazda, we get a standard 2.5-liter four-cylinder engine that produces 187 horsepower, or you can opt for this turbocharged engine, which produces either 227 or 250 horsepower if you feed this higher octane gasoline. It will run safely and effectively on regular unleaded, but it'll reduce power down to 227. Under this hood, we have a 2.5-liter engine that produces 203 horsepower in the base model, a little bit more than we see in the CX-5, or this optional hybrid system, which uses a 2.5-liter engine and 3 motor generator units to give you 219 horsepower combined. It may sound a little bit crazy, but when you look at the numbers, running on regular unleaded, this turbocharged engine is only 8 horsepower more powerful than this 40-mile-per-gallon hybrid system on my other side. But comparing these vehicles is an important lesson in horsepower not being absolutely everything, because this engine's whopping 310 pound-feet of torque is at least 100 pound-feet of torque more than this hybrid system right over here. When it comes to fuel economy, the CX-5 Turbo will average just over 20 miles per gallon in real-world economy, while this RAV4 Hybrid will give you over 40 miles per gallon in real-world driving. So one of the first decisions between RAV4 Hybrid and CX-5 Turbo is how much does the fuel economy matter to you, how much does performance matter to you. The CX-5 that we're looking at and the RAV4 that we're looking at have fairly equal active safety technologies, but each brand is going after active safety a little bit differently in their base trims. The CX-5 gets standard low-speed autonomous braking only, but it gets blind spot monitoring and rear cross-traffic detection, 2 features that we don't see on the base RAV4. Meanwhile, the base RAV4 gives us adaptive cruise control, pedestrian detection, and lane keeping assistance, features that are optional over here on the CX-5. Working your way on up the trim ladder, the CX-5 will give you features like adaptive cruise control with expanded autonomous braking, pedestrian detection, lane keeping assistance, etc. We also get front and rear park sensors on this model, but we don't get the rear emergency braking system that we see available in the RAV4 if you get rear parking sensors in it. Both vehicles also have an available 360-degree camera if you pay extra for it, although the 360-degree camera on the Mazda is not quite as clear as the one in the newer RAV4. So overall, these two vehicles are pretty comparable when it comes to active safety. The overall seating position is pretty similar between the RAV4 and the CX-5. Both have a power driver's seat in the models that we're taking a look at, and both of these vehicles have a 2-way adjustable lumbar support. But I have to say that the lumbar support in the CX-5 hits me a little bit low in the back. I also don't find the seat itself quite as comfortable as what we see in the RAV4, especially for longer road trips. One of the things that I've noticed in the CX-5 is that the seat bottom cushion does seem to be fairly short. Both vehicles have tilt telescopic steering columns with decent ranges of motion. In this top-end CX-5 model, we do have a power passenger seat, but it doesn't have the same range of motion as the driver's seat, and over in the RAV4 Hybrid, we have a manual passenger seat. On paper, it appears that the CX-5 has about 1.5 inches of additional legroom versus the RAV4, but things are a little bit more similar than they appear. That's mainly due to the way the seats are shaped, so I found myself sitting a little bit further rearward to be comfortable in the CX-5 versus a little bit more upright in the RAV4. Although I suspect that if the seats were adjusted identically, then we would get a little bit more room in the CX-5. Thanks to the way this seat is shaped, I can get a little bit more legroom if I kept my knees right there in the center, but that's not going to translate into better child seat carrying capacity. Scooting all the way over to the right side, it appears a little bit more cramped in the CX-5 than the RAV4 because the front seats do move further rearward. That's going to be handier for taller drivers or taller front passengers. The CX-5 has a trick up its sleeve here with this seat back that folds in a 40-20-40 fashion. That is an awful lot more convenient than a 60-40 folding seat back, even though the center section does not move independently of the outboard seat position. When it comes to cargo practicality, the RAV4 is the clear winner here, just as we've come to expect from the RAV4. Very much like the Honda CR-V, we have a large and practical cargo area back here, 37.6 cubic feet and 6 bags in our 24-inch roller bag score. Back here in the CX-5, you could tell that Mazda was prioritizing rear seat legroom as well as that long hood design, and that's why we get a much smaller cargo area back here, 30.9 cubic feet and only 5 bags in our roller's bag score. Upon closer inspection, it may appear that the RAV4's hatch has a steeper rake to it right here, but when you look at the CX-5, you realize that that's not the case, and the CX-5's cargo area is also a little bit shallower than the RAV4. But we do have some nice practical touches back here that I really appreciate. We have a 40-20-40 folding seat design that I mentioned earlier, and you can can fold the center section separately from some levers back here in the cargo area. These rear seat fold levers are things that we do not find in the RAV4. If you want to fold these seats, you have to go over to the side doors and then pull them up from there. The RAV4 features a 2-level cargo area where you could lower the cargo area load floor about 2.5 inches and get a little bit more cargo back here, but I can't do that in my RAV4 because I put a full-size spare tire under here, which does fit in the RAV4. Contrary to what Toyota has said, you can get a matching wheel, matching tire, fit it back there in that cargo well. That's definitely something that I like. Over here in the CX-5, we do have a spare tire. It's one of the temporary or donut style spare tires, and we don't have a 2-level load floor. So instead, the load floor just has these sort of foam blocks right here to space it off of that tire. And unfortunately, the spare tire well is just a little bit too shallow to accommodate a full-size spare tire in here. I did attempt that with the spare tire out of the RAV4 because it's the same tire size that we find over here in the CX-5. Another consideration when thinking about cargo carrying in a small crossover like this is the overall cargo length that's available. So the CX-5 is definitely a little bit shorter on the inside than the RAV4. Now that's logical because this is about an inch shorter overall, but because of the way that Mazda has styled the CX-5, giving us that beautiful long hood up front, it means that we couldn't fit as long items inside. The cargo area itself to the dashboard is about 5 inches shorter in this than it is over here in the RAV4, and that is a pretty big difference. So if you wanted to fit 10-foot items, you could definitely more easily do that in the RAV4 than we could in the CX-5. The CX-5, depending on that item that you might be getting from IKEA, you may have to leave the hatch open. Again, although it may sound odd to be comparing this top-end signature trim to the RAV4 Hybrid, remember that these two vehicles can end up very similarly priced, and the Mazda actually a little bit less expensive than a fully loaded RAV4 Hybrid. On this interior, we have a two-tone setup. It's a little bit difficult to see what's going on camera. The armrest right there on the doors and the leather in the vehicle are a very dark brown, and then the dashboard parts are charcoal. We have real wood trim on this interior, something that we don't find available in the RAV4, and we have real leather upholstery in here, again something that we don't find even available in any of the trims of the RAV4. Now on the downside, due to the older design of the CX-5, this infotainment system is definitely a little on the small side. It is a touchscreen system, but the touch functionality only works when the vehicle is parked. After you're driving along, then it reverts to just the click wheel in the center console. Continuing down the center console, this does appear to be just a little bit more cluttered in terms of overall button count, etc., than what we see in the Toyota. However, I think everything is logically laid out. We have the controller for the infotainment system right back here, just behind the shifter. Both vehicles feature very practical and functional instrument clusters, but in the Mazda, we have a slightly more traditional layout with a tachometer on the left side, fuel level and engine temperature over there on the right, and then everything else in the middle is being delivered by this large 7-inch LCD. This is definitely bigger than the LCD that we find in the RAV4, but unfortunately Mazda's LCD doesn't do quite as much as some of the other LCDs out there. So for instance, all the views that we're cycling through, that's pretty much all you get. You can never really change the overall feel or look of that LCD. Moving out to the steering wheel, both wheels are leather wrapped, but I do find the one in the RAV4 to be a little bit more comfortable. I also think that the buttons on the front of the steering wheel are a little bit more logically laid out than what we see in the Mazda. Both vehicles have the controls for the radar adaptive cruise control on the front of the steering wheel. We also have infotainment buttons on both as well. The first thing you're going to notice out on the road is the acceleration from the turbocharged CX-5. 6.4 seconds 0 to 60 is what we clocked in this model, and it really didn't seem to matter whether we gave this premium or regular unleaded. We still got the same 6.4 seconds 0 to 60. That's just a hair more than a second faster than the RAV4 Hybrid. That should surprise a lot of folks out there because this is only 8 horsepower more powerful, but it's all about that massive 310 pound-feet of torque. The next thing you're going to notice is that we have a 6-speed automatic transmission in the Mazda versus the eCVT or hybrid power split system that we see in the RAV4. So the RAV4 is going to accelerate and feel much more like an electric vehicle than something like this CX-5. That's because the electric motors in the RAV4 are definitely involved in the locomotion of the RAV4. Some folks have asked me, why is it that Mazda is sticking to this tried and true 6-speed automatic transmission? Well, the most logical reason is that the design has long since been paid for. This overall basic design dates back to an older 4-speed design that was then modified into a 5-speed and now into a 6-speed. Now, the downside for this particular transmission is that it is pretty big and pretty heavy physically. And that's one of the reasons that the CX-5 Turbo is really not much lighter than the RAV4 Hybrid, even though the RAV4 has that bigger battery pack, and we also have the electric motor on the rear axle. I suspect that if Mazda were to finally break down and just buy someone's 8, 9, or 10-speed automatic transmission, it would make the CX-5 Turbo even faster and even more fuel efficient. Sixth gear engages right around 40 miles an hour in this CX-5. Now there's definitely enough torque to make that work, so even when the engine's loafing out there around 1400 RPM, you can definitely still feel acceleration, but it does hamper the fuel economy when you're out on the highway, just as we'll talk about a little bit later. Perhaps even more surprising than that is that the RAV4 pulls more G's on a skid pad and obviously out on the road does handle a little bit better than the CX-5. I think some of that has to do with the weight distribution in the CX-5. We have a little bit more weight up front, likely because of that transmission in this model, whereas the battery pack and the electric motor in the RAV4 help move some of the weight to the rear. But the RAV4 also has an absolutely excellently designed suspension in this generation, and that really makes a huge difference out on the road. Now, Alex on Autos does not have access to a skid pad, but publications that do have noticed that the RAV4 does pull a little bit better on that skid pad, as I just mentioned. When it comes to our overall handling score, I keep the RAV4 at the A- that we gave it before, and the CX-5 Turbo at the B+ rating that we gave it last time as well. Remember that the CX-5 Turbo is about the same price as a RAV4 Hybrid, so it's not too shocking that the tire size is overall pretty similar, but I am a little bit sad that Mazda didn't go a little bit out of their way and give this an upgraded tire package. If you were to put 245 or 255 with tires in this, then it would definitely be the handling champion here, because the suspension tune in the CX-5, I think, is a little bit better than in the RAV4s. I like the way this feels out on the road overall better, but the RAV4 actually grips the road better, and that's the distinction between these two. Now, I don't have confirmation on this, and of course Mazda won't officially comment, but I suspect you'd probably be able to buy CX-9 wheels and wider tires and be able to fit them on this CX-5. If you're able to do that, it would definitely improve the overall handling ability. As I've said before, Mazda's Zoom Zoom tagline was never really about overall lateral grip, it was more about feel, and the feel is definitely better in the CX-5. Unfortunately, the grip is not. When it comes to the ride score, I gave both the RAV4 and the CX-5 an A-, but I have to say I find the ride in the RAV4 just a hair more comfortable than the CX-5. It's clear that the CX-5 really was designed to be more of an on-road performer than an off-road performer. That's pretty typical in this segment. We have a suspension that's slightly closer to the ground and just a little bit more firm than the RAV. But overall, both of these vehicles are very comfortable. Whether you drive out on a gravel road like this or you're out on a rough open highway, both of these vehicles are very, very easy to live with crossovers. When it comes to cabin noise, I give the RAV4 a B and keep the CX-5 at an A. This cabin is definitely quieter when it comes to wind noise and road noise out on a smooth road surface, but it is worth noting that out on a rougher road surface, then the RAV4 ends up being a little bit quieter. Remember that there are multiple components to cabin noise. We have road noise, we have wind noise, we have engine noise, etc. So the way that all of those things interact with one another and collect is what gives you that final cabin noise score. If you're out on a rougher road surface, then this CX-5 could be a little bit louder than the RAV4 because of the kind of sound isolation that we see around the floorboards in the Mazda versus the Toyota. Also, if you're accelerating briskly and you're really digging into that accelerator pedal, the CX-5's cabin is going to be a little bit noisier. This engine has a little bit gruffer sound than what we see in the hybrid. But just cruising down the average open highway, the CX-5's cabin is going to be a little bit quieter because wind noise and road noise on certain road surfaces are better controlled than here. Here at Alex on Autos, we always do our own cabin noise testing at 50 miles an hour, and in that test, the CX-5 was a little bit quieter. When it comes to fuel economy, obviously the RAV4 is the big winner here, over 40 miles per gallon in average weekly driving. The CX-5 here, just over 20 miles per gallon in reality. Now, out on the open highway, if you were to treat the turbocharged engine very, very gently, then you could be getting in the mid to high 20s in terms of overall fuel economy. But remember that the mechanical all-wheel drive system is standard in the CX-5 Turbo, and that is going to impact your fuel economy on those longer highway journeys. But any way you slice it, the RAV4 Hybrid is going to be more efficient. Is it going to be more fun? I would argue no. Even though it handles better, I still think the CX-5 is a little bit more fun, and some folks might be willing to give up the fuel economy for that fun factor. Although the RAV4 and CX-5 right next to me are 2019 models, we do know a lot about the 2020 calendar year. For 2020, the RAV4 is getting Android Auto and essentially no additional changes. We expect the price tag to bump up a little bit in the hybrid model, but it's likely going to be pretty similar to 2019. With the Mazda CX-5, Mazda has not yet announced anything, but I don't expect any changes for 2020. The rumor mill tells us that the 2020 CX-5 is already in production, but Mazda tends to wait really until very late in the year to bring out the next model year vehicles. Any way you slice it, these two vehicles are going to be priced very similarly. The RAV4 is going to start at $25,850, the CX-5 at $25,750, so $100 less expensive. Both models are relatively well equipped, although again, the two manufacturers are going after active safety a little bit differently, so they have different active safety systems standard in that base trim. But by the time you've worked your way on up to about $30,000, they're going to be fairly similarly equipped. The models that we're looking at here started at $28,100 for the hybrid, $31,445 for this turbo model over here, because the turbo doesn't happen until some of the top-end trims. This signature trim right behind me started at $36,890, but a limited trim of the RAV4 Hybrid will set you back $36,630, so very, very similar. And if you load that limited all the way on up to be comparable to the signature trim right next to me, it's actually going to be a little bit more expensive than the CX-5. This CX-5 definitely wins the award for being the fastest crossover in this category. Meanwhile, the RAV4 is by far the most efficient. But which one is right for you? That really depends on how you feel about cost of operation. The RAV4's main claim to fame is that this will save you $800 a year in fuel costs for the average driver versus this turbocharged CX-5 right next to me. Over 5 years, that's $4,000, and that will start to level out the price difference between the RAV4 Hybrid and the CX-5 on dealer lots. The CX-5 seems to be going for a slider discount. It also is less expensive in its absolute top-end trim than a fully loaded RAV4. So if you're going to only own the vehicles for about 3 years, the CX-5 could still be a little bit less expensive than this RAV4 Hybrid right over here. But if you plan on keeping your vehicle for 10 years or longer, the RAV4 is certainly going to be the cheaper one to keep around. But what if you didn't want a fully loaded model? What if you only wanted to spend about $34,000 to $35,000? Well, you could get a RAV4 XSE trim. That's going to be the sportier looking RAV4 Hybrid. That we get the soft text interior versus the cloth that we saw here. And you could also get a Mazda CX-5 Turbo for that price. You could get the Grand Touring Reserve trim. The big deal here would be for the same price, you get an awful lot more stuff in the Mazda CX-5. We get ventilated seats, the heated steering wheel, the up-level Bose audio system, real leather, power folding mirrors, etc. A ton of extra content that we don't see available in the RAV4 at that price point. Some features like the heated steering wheel and the ventilated seats you can get in the RAV4, but other things like leather or the power folding mirrors you can't get at any price. So for folks that are looking for mid-priced options, you have to decide, is the fuel economy important to you, or is the power and the more stuff more important to you? And that's one of the reasons that I really like the CX-5 and that I personally find this decision so tricky. If I were going to spend my own money on a vehicle right now and I were to spend $35,000, would I get the RAV4 or would I get the CX-5? I suspect, in all honesty, I would probably get the CX-5 over the RAV4. The RAV4 is incredibly efficient, and it is unquestionably the less expensive vehicle to own and operate. It likely is also going to be a little bit more reliable than this Mazda CX-5 over here. And strangely enough, as we found out in the drive section, the RAV4 handles just a hair better. But I think the CX-5 has more potential when it comes to overall handling ability. If I were to buy the CX-5, I would probably upgrade the tires and wheels aftermarket, maybe find something off of a CX-9 and stick it on there, something along those lines. But the big deal here is that the CX-5 will give you more feature content for the money and an incredible amount of performance. It also is an awful lot prettier, in my opinion. Now, this RAV4 has definitely become far more attractive in this generation than the last, but the CX-5 really is a gorgeous crossover. And you can get it for about $30,000 quite easily, $32,000 approximately for the turbo, $35,000 for a very well-equipped turbo. So if I were spending my own money, this would be my option, but I probably wouldn't buy it in refrigerator white. I'd probably get a red one. Be sure and let me know what you think about all that down there in the comments section below. Let me know what you would choose if you're shopping between about $35,000 and $40,000. Would you get something like this Mazda CX-5? Would you go the fuel-efficient route and get something like this RAV4 Hybrid right over here? Or would you try and get something like a very small luxury crossover? Let me know down there in the comments section below. Be sure and find us over at facebook.com/AlexDautos if you haven't already done so. Hit that subscribe button. Join us down there. You can hit that join button and find all of our videos at least a few days before they're launched to the rest of the folks out there. I'll see you later.